and thank you all for being here tonight. On behalf of the UC Berkeley School of Public Health, good evening. I'm Will Dowd, Interim Dean of this school, and we are thrilled to be here today with the East Bay launch of the Every Woman Treaty. And I understand it's not only the East Bay, we're doing this in the East Bay on the UC Berkeley campus, but it's also the Bay Area and the California launch of the Every Woman Treaty effort. So you can tell your kids in just a few years that you were here that night in Berkeley when the Every Woman campaign was launched. At that time, it seemed like a Don Quixote quest. But here we are, just a few years later, and we not only have an international treaty addressing violence against women, but one that was proudly signed by our first woman president of the United States. That's where we envision being in a few years. We are thrilled that tonight we will learn how to get from here to there, at least one important step along that campaign. To create a context for our discussion tonight, I just want to note that the World Health Organization estimates that for women between the ages of 15 and 44, violence against these women causes more deaths and disabilities than cancer, malaria, traffic accidents, and war all taken together. There is an incredibly serious, massive epidemic of violence against women out there in the world. To those who think that this seems like a Don Quixote-like campaign, I think that this is an opportune time to remind us all of the words that I'm sure many of you know of Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And I want to thank everyone who has brought us here together tonight, both our guests who are pushing forward this campaign, as well as those locally, particularly Professor Harry Snyder, who is faculty at the UC Berkeley School of Public Health, leading an advocacy initiative. And he has a number of graduate students that are working with him on this initiative: Zach Fernandez, Tatiana Roberts, Lujane Alsala. And many other people are always behind the scenes in these efforts. So thank you to everyone who I've left off. So without further ado, I will hand over to Professor Laurie Dorfman, also with the School of Public Health, who has taught with us for many years, who will MC the rest of the program. So thank you.
Thank you to the Dean. Thank you to the School of Public Health for sponsoring this and for being the launch site. It's pretty exciting. I'm really happy to be here because of the topic. And that I have taught at the School of Public Health for some time. I also lead the Berkeley Media Studies Group, which isn't affiliated with the university, but is a close friend. And when we opened our doors in 1993, we opened them with the idea about making violence a public health issue. Was that possible? Would people understand it? And the answer is yes, but we need more attention to it, and we need people to understand the various aspects of violence, and we've been studying it for a long time. We've studied gun violence, we've studied child sexual abuse, we've studied sexual abuse generally among women, we've studied intimate partner violence, and all these studies in the news, all these studies are of how the news covers these issues, and there is a big piece left out, and that has to do with what the public health aspect is and what the context is. And we're going to learn a lot about the context for violence tonight, and it's really important to us at BMSG, it's important to us at the School of Public Health, and so I think this panel is going to be just the start of a conversation that's going to go on a long time to get this job done. So we're really fortunate tonight with the panelists that we have. So I'm going to tell you who we're going to hear from tonight. There's going to be plenty of time for discussion and questions. We're going to hear just about 10 minutes from our panelists, and then we will have a conversation among all of us, and then some treaty signing at the end. So we're going to start with Lisa Shannon, who is the co-founder of Every Woman Treaty, and She is a human rights activist, a women's rights activist, a public health activist, and a scholar. She's going to tell us how this started. What's the genesis of this? How did we all come to be in this room together at once? Then we're going to hear from Pike Long. Pike is at the St. James Infirmary. She is an organizer. She is organizing the people who suffer most from violence and from violence against women and gendered violence. And so she's going to tell us what that means locally. And it's important to have that local perspective, because even though this is a global issue, a global treaty, something that we want the UN to take up, it happens in specific places and specific times, and it's that specificity that we have to understand, and we have to hear from the people who are experiencing it themselves, because they're going to know best what to do about it. And then it's up to us to make those connections globally. And so that's why next we're going to hear from Francisco Rivera, who's going to give us, he's on the steering committee of Every Woman Treaty, and he's going to give us a legal perspective, and not just a legal perspective, but an international perspective, and help us understand how we blend public health with human rights and what that looks like when it's braided together, because the solutions are going to come from a lot of different directions, so we have to understand these different perspectives. And then our last panelist isn't quite here yet. We will hear from Charlie Clements. He is renowned, the co-founder also of Every Woman Treaty, but with a history who he'll be able to tell us what the historical perspective of this is. And when we're faced with such a daunting task as Every Woman Treaty has set out for itself, then it's important to know where we have succeeded in the past, and we have succeeded in the past. And Charlie will tell us a little bit about what that means and how we can apply it. So that is it from me. I'm going to elicit your questions later on, but I'm going to turn it over to Shannon, who's going to tell us how we got here. What are we doing in this room together?
Thank you. And thank you. So, yeah, really such a treat to be here. Someone said to me recently that the journey of activism is a journey upstream. And that has certainly been true for me. Another person I ran into who's done a lot of fundraising in the women's rights movement framed it this way. She talked about giving 1.0 as being emergency response. So typically that would be people responding to, a tsunami, or in the case of violence against women, direct service, crisis lines, that kind of thing. 2.0 in the women's rights space being individual empowerment, girls' education, economic empowerment for women. And that has been a place where there's been a tremendous amount of focus over the last couple of decades, actually, and in particular, more and more you hear about that. But the 3.0 is systems change, and that's where there's been very little focus. And actually, it's interesting because my journey as an activist has actually exactly followed that path. My first job out of college was working in women's shelters in Portland, Oregon, at domestic violence shelters for 5 years, answering the hotline, spending almost every night there on the night shift for 5 years. And then moved out of that altogether for quite some time, and then ended up stumbling into doing work for women in the Congo, specifically fundraising to support women through a group called Women for Women International, a woman-to-woman sponsorship program giving her education and economic empowerment and rebuilding her life following war, what was considered the worst place on earth for women at that time. And I went on to co-found the first sexual violence crisis center in Mogadishu, Somalia, at a time that it was an active war zone, partnering with an incredible Somali woman activist there, again, trying to reach women who had been forgotten and that no one was paying attention to. And we had tremendous success. For Women, ultimately Run for Congo Women raised about $18 million, supporting 90,000 Congolese women and kids. In Somalia, within 6 months of opening the center that we had started on, 30 women pledging $10 a month, we were on the cover of the New York Times, broke the silence on rape in Mogadishu. Women's rights made it into the new Somali constitution. Fartoon and Ilwad, my co-founders, were being quoted in international press. They've sort of become superstars. Most importantly, a lot of the women coming to the center ended up going back out to communities and becoming voices in IDP camps, internally displaced persons camps, and became women's rights activists. So it was this tremendous success, and really not in that much time. In 2013, I went back to Mogadishu, though, and it's true, like a ton had changed on the ground. People were talking more openly. There was all this momentum. And then the week that I went back, the government arrested a woman for talking to a journalist about being gang raped by government soldiers. The evidence that they used to convict her of false accusations against the government was something called a finger test. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, and there's a bit of a trigger warning. Basically, the evidence was this mother of three who had birthed 3 children. If a midwife could fit more than 2 fingers in her, she could not have possibly been raped. That's the law in Somalia. She was convicted on that. And what was interesting is that week in Mogadishu, everyone knew about it. At the center, I was at the center. I mean, I co-founded the center. No one would talk to me. No one would talk to each other. All those women's rights activists who had been out there in the camps doing their thing all of a sudden wouldn't talk to anybody. And what I realized is in one chilling government action, 1.5 years of progress had been wiped out. Interestingly, the same week, the new Somali president was traveling around meeting with 27 foreign ministers, courting aid for the new Somalia, the progressive Somalia. And fortunately, this case made the international press. A petition was circulated. 700,000 people signed the petition saying this woman should be released. Several foreign ministers brought it up in the meetings, and they did end up releasing this woman. Which was great. It was very exciting. But the thing that really chewed at me is, what about all the women who don't get 700,000 signatures? What about all the women who don't have 27 foreign ministers, jumping to their aid? And the truth is, with Somalia, there was no line that Somalia had crossed. There was no standard that foreign ministers could point to and say, you have gone where nations do not go. They could say, tisk, tisk, you ought not behave that way, but there was no international standard. And so 3 things occurred to me at this time. One, that advocates working on the front lines, on fumes. I mean, we started this program, like I said, with about $300 a month in funding, can change so much, like unbelievable progress. And 2, that progress can be wiped out with one predatory government act. And because of that, there's a very real ceiling on the progress that frontline women's rights activists can make without structural support, without serious structural support. Number 3, that governments, most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time, actually care what other governments think. So it was through this process that I realized also none of this is unique to Somalia. That the finger test is legal in Somalia. In Jordan, for instance, domestic violence is illegal if there's a case of what they call serious harm. But serious harm is defined as a woman being hospitalized more than 9 days. In the United States, I recently heard about a Georgetown student who was raped and became pregnant. She decided to keep the baby. The rapist sued for parental rights, and now she has to see him every weekend for the next 20 years. In 31 US states, rapists maintain parental rights. So this violence is everywhere, and I found myself really grappling with this idea. It was like the worst place on earth to be a woman, Congo, Somalia, is it her own home? Because this violence is everywhere. It's 1 out of 3 women globally who have just survived domestic violence or rape. This doesn't include female genital mutilation, sexual harassment. 1 out of 3. And so when violence is this widespread, it's everyone. It's our sisters, it's our aunts, it's ourselves. And I don't know if any of you are like me, some of the women in the room, like, I've never identified as a survivor, and yet I'm sitting through the Kavanaugh hearings, and I'm like, oh, wait a minute, I got out of it that time, and I escaped it that time. And you think about all the near misses, and you really start questioning what survivor is, even when, if you're female anywhere on earth, you know you've had multiple incidents throughout your life where your safety has been threatened. So, but here's the thing, it's all of us, and yet we can stop it. And we owe it to every human being on earth to address this through systemic change. And that's why we're working on a treaty. So why a treaty, you ask? Because treaties get governments to make commitments they would not otherwise make. And in this case, commitments for proven interventions. I took some time out and went to graduate school a few years ago, right around that time that I went to Mogadishu, when I met men like Charlie Clements, who will be here any minute, I promise. Learned about the Landmines Treaty, later the Tobacco Treaty, and hosted a convening where we brought together women's rights activists in 2013. And I met this amazing woman on my left, your right, Vidya Shri, a survivor of forced marriage herself. And the day after our convening, we decided we were going to launch a campaign, that we were going to spend the time that it took to ask activists around the world, not do we need a treaty, because a treaty is just an agreement. What would a treaty need to look like in order to actually be meaningful to frontline advocates? Being keenly aware, Vidya, when we had coffee that day, I remember her asking me over and over, yeah, but what do you want the treaty to be? Like, what's it got to be? And I'm like, I'm not the decider. I don't know. Like, we need to ask the experts. We need to ask the people who are survivors, who have lived through this. There's a lot of nuance here. Let's engage in that process. And so that's where we've been for the last 5.5 years, is in a deep process of asking thousands of frontline women's rights activists, what does a treaty need to look like in order to be meaningful and to mean real safety for women and girls? And so we have arrived at pretty basic approach, which combines the best of public health and human rights. We want it to be hosted by the World Health Organization, and we want it to do some pretty basic things, employing evidence-based interventions to end the violence. And so we call it the whole hand framework as a simple way to remember it. These are the interventions that pretty much all experts agree work. So if you think of comprehensive national reform, then these are the prongs of that reform. 1, clean up the laws, no more finger tests, no more arrests for false accusations. Number 2, and I will say quickly, in places where there's just a law on domestic violence, just a law, we're not talking about how well it's written, how well it's implemented, 33% lower mortality rate for adult women. And they've even controlled for income and education level, and it still holds. So highly significant. Law does save lives. Secondly, better if people know about the law. So police, judges, but also doctors and nurses, because often they're the first people coming into contact with survivors. And then services, of course, services. You have to provide that frontline support so women can get away if they need to and rebuild their lives. And lastly, prevention education. That was one of the biggest surprises to me, listening to frontline advocates, that I came in, that first convening, I titled everything Criminalizing Violence Against Women, and they were like, no, that is not the way to go. Prevention education, if nothing else, prevention education, because that's where you get real culture change. And so it really shifted our focus. So this, you can only get done if you fund it. But it turns out that treaties can catalyze exponential increases in cash. So for instance, with the Landmines Treaty, within 36 hours of introducing it, $500 million in commitments. And that was not just for the first year. The budget has continued to be $400 to $500 million per year since 1997. I'll mention just this one little bit, and then I'm going to stop talking, because I just heard it last week and I was fascinated. What do you think the total global spend is every year on just women's rights? $45 billion. $45 billion a year, but Those are all of the programs that include women's rights as a secondary outcome. For the programs that are exclusively focused on women's rights, it's only 4% of that, which is less than $2 billion. And of that, only 2% of it goes to frontline women's rights activists who are doing the best of this work. We want our fund to be a $4 billion a year fund just on violence against women and girls, most of which will go to frontline women's rights activists. So I'm going to stop talking, but that's the primer on what we're working on. Thank you.
Thank you. So go ahead and have a seat. And Pike, you want to stay? You want to go to the podium? What do you want to do?
Well, I was going to just sit, but I guess I can go.
You can sit. You're fine there.
Okay, well, hi. I'll just sit. Why not? I don't know if my mic is, oh, there it goes. Okay, hi, thanks. Okay, so hi, I'm Pike Long. I'm Deputy Director of St. James Infirmary. We are located in San Francisco, and if you haven't heard of us, we are the nation's first and only occupational health and safety clinic that is run for and by people in the sex trades. We've been around since 1999, so we're about to celebrate our 20th anniversary. And you know, we exist to provide services, direct services to the exact kind of folks that are most at the intersections, most at the margins of, and at highest risk of violence. I'll tell you a little bit more about my background too, just before I dive into what we're doing at St. James. But prior to my work with St. James, I actually recently graduated from this very Berkeley School of Public Health, where I got to study with Harry, which is fabulous, thank you. And I think that, you can correct me if I'm wrong, one of the reasons he thought I might be a good fit is because some of the other work I've done is I've done a lot of work with folks who are incarcerated, particularly trans women and gender nonconforming folks, and prior to that with cisgender women in the San Francisco County jails. And prior to that, I did lots of health education with young people, especially folks who they called street involved, so either homeless, marginally housed, or otherwise involved in street economies. Lots of those young people were also incarcerated. So I've been working for quite a long time in the Bay Area with folks that almost all have seen tremendous amounts of violence that they, you know, didn't really have the choice to escape. And so it's really deeply important to me that we manage to tie together, like you're saying, like the local issues on the ground and what this actually looks like on a day-to-day basis for human beings, individuals, and then how does that get all the way up to this massive international treaty, which sounds so giant and obscure in some ways. So thanks for inviting me. So we already know that the women who face other forms of structural discrimination are at the highest risk of violence. So who are these women? Poor and unhoused women are, if you look around the streets of San Francisco and ask any single woman who's out there, or gender nonconforming person, might I add, they're at massive risk of assault just for existing, just for being outside, just for living. Transgender women can't even walk down the street or get on a bus without fear of assault if they get clocked. I can't tell you how many trans women I have in my life who live in perpetual fear of violence simply, again, for existing as who they are. Sex workers, needless to say, I work at a sex worker clinic. Sex workers are at massively disproportionate risk of violence, not just from clients, but from random passersby who assume them to be working at the time. From police, unfortunately, about a quarter of assaults reported by sex workers are assaults at the hands of police. So something to really work on. Migrant laborers, when we think about the levels of assault, sexual and physical, amongst women who are undocumented and who are doing work in fields, in kitchens, in nail salons, and the levels of exploitation that they face, that's absolutely somebody that we also see actually in the clinic. Women who are addicted to substances and struggle with that are extremely vulnerable. And finally, women who face mental illness. And this is just off the top of my head, some notes I took. But yeah, women who struggle with mental illness are also incredibly vulnerable. And why is this a vulnerability? And it's because I think in our society, these are women and people who are considered largely disposable. They're not necessarily considered to be contributing members of society. And I'll tell you, as somebody who's worked closely with folks in all of these categories for quite a long time, nothing could be further from the truth. Like, actually, in my experience, most of the most intelligent, brilliant, thoughtful, compassionate, radical people fall into at least one of these categories. And they're not disposable, and we need to actually stand up and actually make sure that they are counted and protected against violence as well. I want to go a little bit into sex workers because that is our area of expertise at St. James Infirmary, and just talk a little bit about some of the struggles that sex workers in particular face. And I'm going to tell you, we very strongly believe at St. James Infirmary that the source of most violence against sex workers isn't actually anything inherent about, bad clients or bad people. It's the stigma that sex workers live with day to day makes violence permissible. It makes it so that a dead hooker joke is still an acceptable thing for people to make, whereas we've made so many strides in so many other places. It means that, again, like we're the butt of jokes in movies. It's just an ongoing onslaught of aggression that I think really lends to this sense of permissiveness to just like, oh, they're throwaway people. They're not even people. Dehumanization. And of course, sex workers aren't going to be safe going to the police if they are assaulted. I mean, again, even as a highly privileged person, I don't feel safe going to the police. The police have not been my friend, not even as a sex worker, as an activist. I've been brutalized by the police numerous times just for being at a protest. So, how safe do we feel? And I'm not here to bash the cops, but really, like, we need better frameworks and we need better solutions. And I'm really glad that you brought up, because one of the things when I was reading the treaty that really came up, I was like, well, this is a carceral approach. The very first thing is criminalize and punish. And I'm like, yeah, in some extreme cases, that is the thing, right? But I'm so glad that you brought it back to what we really, really need is a sea change. We need education. We need stuff that really focuses on humanizing one another, teaching not just men and boys, but all of us, but particularly men and boys, how to treat women and girls and gender nonconforming folks with the respect, love, and care that they deserve. And so some of the stuff that we're doing here at St. James, though, because we do take a really we don't really believe that the prison industrial complex is ever going to solve the problems. We think it's a continuation of the racist and genocidal, beginnings of our nation. I'm not going to get on my soapbox, but we don't really think that that's the solution, right? It's like a dire last resort as far as we're concerned. So we try to combat that with community-based programming. We do tons of training. We do outreach. We do offer to our immediate community, we offer clinical services. We offer mental health support. And we're always trying, in fact, one of my board members is here right now. And so we're constantly trying to figure out how do we improve? How do we build? Where are the gaps still existing and how do we improve? And make sure that our agency is as relevant as possible to the immediate needs. This has been a brutal year for people in the sex trades. I don't know how much anyone has been paying attention who isn't directly impacted, but who here has heard of FOSTA SESTA? Okay, I see like 3 hands. I'm just gonna really quickly say, last April, almost a year ago, Congress passed a law, and Donald Trump gladly signed it in, that made it illegal for anyone to, it basically made it so that websites could be held liable for any content that promoted or facilitated prostitution on the internet. This was a huge deal because actually for many years, sex workers had started moving away from street-based sex work, which we know is much, much riskier, and you need a very specialized skill set to navigate that safely. A skill set that most of us just frankly will never have. So sex workers started coming indoors because they could safely advertise and vet for clients online, right? This was touted as an anti-trafficking measure, and it was really celebrated by all these people who were, yay, now that the internet isn't gonna be a place where you can find, a potential trafficking victim, all trafficking will end. Well, guess what? That didn't happen. In fact, actual trafficking has been pushed much further underground. Sex workers who were adult consenting sex workers and doing this for economic necessity or just because they wanted to have that kind of freedom and flexibility in their lives were suddenly shut out of a job overnight. resulting in serious financial crisis for many people who were supporting families, supporting themselves, putting themselves through school. It also meant that a lot of people got forced to either go back out to the street, where many of them had never worked outside before and didn't understand how to navigate that successfully. And it also forced, and that just made it a lot harder for the girls who are already working on the street. So I know my time is coming to an end. So one of the things that we've been really working on at St. James is working on not just an end to FOSTA and SESTA, but really decriminalizing sex work so that actually it can position people in the sex trades to root out trafficking, because those of us who are all up on there are the ones who can identify it the fastest and actually have been the biggest allies to law enforcement in locating and rescuing those people, assisting, I would prefer to say. I don't like the word rescue at all. And we're about to offer self-defense classes at St. James for sex workers. So if you'd like to learn more, please go to our website. We always take donations, and we are looking for sponsors for our gala. That's my pitch. I have more to say, but I will end it now. Thanks.
Hi. Thank you, that was great. And we're going to have time for questions and things like that, so don't worry. So Francisco, do you want to stay? You want to put it in the...
I'll stay right here. That's
Okay.
okay with you.
That's just fine.
And so thank you for that. And you always take the opportunity to do fundraise, especially with the captive audience. Hello everybody. My name is Francisco Rivera. I'm a human rights attorney from Puerto Rico. And I'm currently teaching law at Santa Clara Law School down in the South Bay. I run an international human rights clinic where students get to not only learn about international human rights law, but actually practice it by representing human rights victims, survivors, and doing policy advocacy and litigation work in various international law fields, one of which is violence against women. In my prior life, I used to work as a senior attorney at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and later on I will talk a little bit about the law on violence against women in the Inter-American system. And as a result of that sort of work that I was doing before, I got contacted by Vilia, who was in the prior slide, one of the co-founders, and they asked the students in my clinic, hey, can you do a study on the effectiveness of international law as it relates to violence against women? Are there any gaps in international law that we need to address that maybe a treaty could actually help with? And we said yes. That was, I think, 2013, 14, when we were starting at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, the Carr Center. And we, guess what? We did identify there were some gaps in international law that we'll address today. Then I like to emphasize on implementation and how this treaty is going to be actually monitored, right? When you have a violation, then what, right? And so they asked me to chair a committee with the wonderful people from all over the world. I want to emphasize this is a worldwide movement where you have input, from survivors you mentioned, but also academics and then workers, attorneys, from all levels, public health professionals, everything. And we analyzed that issue, and then they said, well, now we have to sort of draft the treaty. So I got the task of actually drafting some of the language in the treaty about implementation. And they said, well, why don't you come into the steering committee? And that means that I get to speak with beautiful people like you. So, and I'm down the road, so that's great. So that's my connection to Every Woman Treaty. But I want to take the opportunity to just step back a little bit and know your audience. Public speaking 101, know your audience. So usually I speak to either law students or lawyers, but that's not the case here. So I guess it's my role to sort of step back and saying, what's a treaty, right? And we keep hearing this word treaty, and I'm sure you've heard about signing a treaty and ratifying a treaty, but what does that really mean, right? So let me just step back a little bit and provide some of that context, right? So treaties are nothing else than just sources of legal obligation, just like any other law. You got federal statutes, you got local statutes. Well, a treaty is another source of law that's just an international source of law, right? And you have treaties at the United Nations, you have treaties at different regional organizations. Can you think of the European Union, the African Union, the Organization of American States? So that's the equivalent to our state laws, right? So we have both international, we have regional, we have federal law, we have local law, different types of law. All of those are simply sources of legal obligations, right? So a treaty is a particular type of international source of legal obligation. And there are several United Nations treaties on human rights. There's actually 9 main treaties. None of them addresses specifically the issue of violence against women. So we have one. Anybody know what CEDAW stands for? CEDAW. Thank you for saying that, because that is what it should be, but it's not. It's the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Now, if you look at CEDAW and you control F and put some search terms and you try to find sexual assault, it's not there. You try to find rape, it's not there. Domestic violence, it's not there. There are some forms of violence. Human trafficking, I think, is in there. But there is no specific content in that United Nations Treaty on Women's Rights that addresses specifically the issue of violence against women and girls. One way that the United Nations has gotten around that issue is there's this body, international body, that's in charge of interpreting CEDAW, of providing a better understanding of what the text of CEDAW means. And that body of experts has actually issued two things called general comments. One in the 80s, one actually last year or 2 years ago, explaining that, when we talk about discrimination, we also meant to say violence against women, right? And that's great. Actually, the content of those comments are fantastic. Yeah. But they're comments, they're not treaties. So the binding nature of those comments, we call that soft law for a reason, is questionable, right? So based and playing the devil's advocate, some people say we don't need a new treaty because we have that. We have CEDAW and we have international experts who have interpreted CEDAW to mean that it also applies in the context of violence against women. So we're saying that's just simply not enough. Because of the gravity of the situation, we need something much more specific. And voila, you want to sit over here?
Charlie, you can come.
Please. This is our final panelist, Charlie Clements, founder. Anyway, so if you look at CEDAW, it doesn't say anything about violence against women, and we think that it's important to have a specific treaty on violence against women. And guess what? We have examples of regional treaties that have been successful, and we can look to those as an example of why this actually works. So let me walk you through those, right? Welcome, and very nice to meet you. So, and just to put it in terms of chronological order, CEDAW actually came into effect in 1981, right? So until 1995, it was the only real international treaty on women's rights. But in 1995, the Americas got together and decided, wait a minute, we want to do our own treaty, and we do want it to address violence against women, because guess what? We learn from mistakes and we build from previous experience. So that's what the Americas did. And they passed something called the Belém do Pará Convention. The name comes from the city in Brazil where it was adopted. But the official name, bear with me, the Inter-American Convention on the Prevention, Punishment, and Eradication of Violence Against Women. I think every woman treaty is much better. So that particular treaty provides this legal framework that specifically focused a whole treaty on violence against women, right? And it proved to be successful. For example, in Brazil, after ratifying the Belém do Pará Convention, Brazil actually made many changes, most of which are in that hand approach that Shannon was mentioning before. I can highlight, for example, that they established specialized domestic violence courts. They created several prevention and treatment centers, and different mechanisms for survivors that didn't exist were it not for having ratified this treaty. And I should add, having a government that actually wanted to implement this treaty. Political will is key in implementation, right? In Mexico, similarly, they relied on the normative framework that developed in the Inter-American system to actually modify their laws. They modified their constitution even, and they further developed their domestic laws to make sure, that you not only address, from a punitive perspective, which I think we all agree in the human rights world, that's a piece of the puzzle, but can never be the whole puzzle, right? And they made a lot of changes that have proven to actually work, right? So as a result of that, other regions in the world looked at the Americans saying, oh, we should do that. And so from 1995, which is when Belém do Pará was entered into force, we have 10 years later, ironically, like almost every 10 years, we have a new treaty, regional treaty. So 10 years later, in the African region, they passed the Maputo Protocol, which is also on the same thing. It's actually the protocol of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. and it's on the rights of women in Africa. So that Maputo Protocol is another fancy name for a treaty. It's just a baby treaty that is attached to a larger treaty, but it's still binding. It's not a comment, right? So Africa was doing that, and I will mention that the definition of violence that they added in the Maputo Protocol is much better than what we had in both CEDAW and the Belém do Pará, because it actually adds economic violence to the definition of violence against women. So we keep learning, we keep developing, and we keep improving. And then in 2014, so almost 10 years after the Maputo Protocol, we have the European Union actually passed the Istanbul Convention. And that's the latest fantastic development that we have on the issue of violence against women. And they took implementation to the next level. They actually created very, very out-of-the-box thinking on how we can actually implement this treaty. So that's the legal framework that we have right now. No United Nations Treaty on Violence Against Women, a couple of regional treaties that, if you were paying attention to the regions, simply does not cover the whole world. So we have a bunch of regions that are not covered by these regional treaties. That's one of the reasons why we're advocating for a UN treaty that would cover the whole world instead of leaving it to, it's kind of like federal law versus state law. We want to have a federal law rather than just a state law for every state. So it's the equivalent, right? So guess what? The U.S. has not ratified any of those. We have ratified, of the United Nations Human Rights Treaties, 3 of them that at least tangentially cover women's rights. One is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The other one is the Convention Against Torture. And the third one is the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And there's 2 protocols to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which we are the only country in the world that has not ratified, that do address some issues of violence for girls at least, right? So the idea here is, to create this United Nations treaty is really, my time is really over? Okay. Is to create this United Nations treaty that will take the lessons learned, the collective lessons learned from what we know from more than 30 years of practice. And I want to emphasize that this process is the product, as I mentioned, not of just of great leadership, which we do have, as you can see, but this is how many calls do we have? At 4 in the morning here in California, and then Uganda is 11 at night, and then Russia, and then we're all in a Skype or a Zoom call together, trying to really collectively think, is this the best we could do? And just don't trust us. Trust the thousands of people who have worked in this process saying, yes, this is the best we can do right now. I'll be happy to answer questions about treaty process and about treaty content as well. Thank you.
Francisco, thank you.
Thank you.
So Charlie, welcome to the panel. I'm Laurie. It's really nice to meet you.
Laurie, very nice to meet you.
Let me tell you what's happened, and then I'll invite you to join in. Lisa started by telling us why we're in this room together, what the genesis was, why we need this, what it's about. Pike followed her and talked about what it meant from the local level, what it means for the women who are really getting harmed and why they have to be at the front of our thinking and the front of this conversation. And then Francisco talked about the legal perspective. And what I'm hoping you'll help us all understand is how something like this is even possible. Can we really succeed? Does history give us any lessons for going forward and having faith that we can make this come to pass?
Terrific. Well, thank you. Is my mic on? Is that okay? Apologize for being late. I'm on a very small faculty about 30 miles north of here, and today was one of our 6 admissions days, and all 8 faculty have to participate, so I'm sorry I couldn't get away. But thank you, and thank you all for coming. In just a few minutes, I need to convince you why a treaty like this can happen, and why we can have a treaty addressing these gaps in law that leave women and girls so vulnerable to violence. And I'm going to refer to 2 precedents that Francisco might have referred to that will help give us confidence about that. And the first is the Landmines Treaty, which was promulgated in 1997 and entered force as international law. So when a treaty is promulgated, nations step up and sign it, and by signing it, they say, we're going to take this back to our parliament, and they're going to ratify it. And when enough nations have ratified it, it enters force, it becomes international law. So the Landmines Treaty entered force faster than any treaty in history prior to that in just 2 years, and it did 4 things. It banned the use, production, and transfer of anti-personnel mines. It called for the destruction of all stockpiles of mines. It focused attention on resources for the victims of landmines, and it mandated mines education as well as mines clearance in countries that were plagued with them. This was not an arms control agreement led by governments. It was led by NGOs. It was led by NGOs who were seeing that the numbers of injuries were climbing steadily, and their ability to provide prostheses to the victims was climbing at this kind of rate. And they said, you know, if they could ban dum-dum bullets after World War I, the bullets that exploded when they hit you, why can't we ban this horrendous weapon? And we started that campaign in 1989. There were 6 NGOs that started the effort, and by 1997, we had an international treaty, and as a result of that, won the Nobel Prize, not for a lifetime of work, but because we had created a new path to diplomacy, one led by civilians, not by governments, not by the military. You know, Russia and the US and China did not sign that treaty, did not ratify it. It didn't surprise us. They were at the table trying to water it down all along the way. But there's a very famous, if you're a lawyer, a very famous lawyer at Columbia named Louis Hinken, who sometimes is called the father of international law. And Louis Hinken used to say, most nations obey most international law most of the time. And he was making the point that even though there's no police to enforce international law, the fact is countries don't like to be outliers. They don't like to be, the State Department terms it this way, they don't like to be outside the community of civilized nations, which we accuse countries of that we don't agree with often. But in other words, Russia, China, and the US refused to sign the treaty, but they felt guilty about not signing it. So each of those nations the next year passed a law forbidding the export of landmines. They were the largest manufacturers in the world, and each of them said, well, you know, we're not going to give them up. Our army loves them too much, but we're not going to allow anyone else to use the mines that we manufacture. So it was a great victory for the campaign. Even though those countries didn't sign it, and we weren't really expecting them to. So when you hear about the letters ICBL, it stands for the International Campaign to Ban Landmines. It succeeded in establishing that treaty, a coalition of NGOs, and winning the 1997 Nobel Prize. Now I said I was going to refer to 2 things. The other one is called the FCTC, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. Not as bad as Belém in terms of a title, but kind of clumsy because it's called the Tobacco Treaty for short. But you've felt the impact of that already, although you might not know anything about it. Promulgated in 2003 by the World Health Organization, it was the first public health treaty in the world. And it required governments to do several things. 1, impose restrictions on tobacco advertising, sponsorship, and promotion to minors. You know, when we used to have music festivals in San Francisco, they used to hand out free cigarettes, little packages of 5 or 10 cigarettes to kids trying to hook them. They can't do that anymore. They have to have new packaging and warnings on tobacco products, you know, with a skull and crossbones and saying this is dangerous for your health. They have to establish clean indoor air controls, and not having smoking sections of restaurants or smoking sections of bars or smoking sections on aircraft, as you may remember not so long ago. So it's recently celebrated its 15th anniversary, and it's had a remarkable impact. None more important, though, than defeating the multiple lawsuits brought by Big Tobacco, claiming countries had no legal authority to regulate these things. And so there have been 300 such lawsuits by tobacco companies and tobacco interests challenging a country's ability to do this. And knowing the litigious nature of the tobacco industry, many countries were hesitant to impose these controls before the treaty because they knew they would be tied up in terribly expensive lawsuits that could drag on for years and cost them millions of dollars. And let me give you an example. There was a strong opposition to control measures in Uruguay and Australia because they were sued because the packaging and label of tobacco products really made the manufacturers angry. In Kenya, a case of British American Tobacco versus a Cabinet Secretary of Health, for example, the Court of Appeal of Kenya considered a challenge to the tobacco control regulations, a suite of measures. Tobacco companies claim that the Kenyan government didn't have the authority to do this. And in this victory, and the victory in Uruguay, and the victory in Australia, and I'm not going to go through the other 299 or 300, what was cited in the judgment of the courts was the FCTC. They said this establishes the authority of the state to do this by its very nature. So Philip Morris, Norway versus Healthcare Services of Norway, the Oslo district found that it accepted in the court battle knowledge that tobacco advertising, promotion, and sponsorship led to increased consumption of tobacco products. They said that's just a given fact. And in fact, Norway was able to implement the controls that it wanted to. So, as I said, 331 different lawsuits, and in about 80% of them where there were victories, and most of them were victories, there were victories because they cited this treaty as the authority for countries to do this. So tobacco companies estimate that tobacco products cause about $1 trillion annually in medical expenses and lost productivity. Let's compare that. Lisa probably mentioned to you earlier, that the World Bank estimates that violence against women costs us globally about 5.3% of the global economy, or $4 trillion. So violence against women is costing us 4 times what tobacco losses amount to. And if we can do it for tobacco, we should be able to do it for violence against women. Landmines were estimated in 1997 when we implemented the treaty, when we promulgated the treaty, to kill or wound 25,000 people annually. Violence wounds or kills 2.5 million women a year. In other words, 1,000 times as many women are killed or wounded by violence than were killed by tobacco, killed by landmines in a year. So this problem is 1,000 times more serious than the issue that mobilized our coalition. So think about it. If you're my age, you probably remember a time when there were no seatbelts. And how did that change? It changed when someone passed a law mandating seatbelts. And some states didn't go along with it. Montana said, no, we don't want seatbelts. They said, fine, you can lose your highway money and you can do without seatbelts. But eventually, they all came along. This is how things change. Think about it. When I was growing up, people threw hamburger wrappers and cups out the windows of the cars all the time. How did it change? It changed because Lady Bird Johnson introduced the Beautification of Highways Act and made it illegal to litter on the highways. So laws are the beginning of how cultural change happens. As Rashida Manjoo, the Special Rapporteur for Violence Against Women, said, how can we hold perpetrators of violence against women accountable if there's no protections in law because of these gaps in law that exist all over the world? So, in concluding, I just want to repeat something that Will might have mentioned earlier, but to create the context for this discussion, WHO estimates that for women between 15 and 44 years old, violence, that is interpersonal violence, causes more deaths and disabilities than cancer, malaria, traffic accidents, and war taken together. So around the world, more women are killed, and 70% of that violence against women is directed by intimate partners. So thank you.
Charlie, thank you so much. Fantastic panel. I want to ask Tatiana to come up here just to be up here with the panel. But while we do that, because we want to tell you about the treaty and the signing, but are there any questions? We have just a few minutes left. But come on up here while you do that. Let's see if is there anybody who wants to raise a question? Right there. Oh, yes. Please tell us who you are and ask your question. I don't know if we do have a mic.
It's okay. We can hear you.
Well, we'll need to hear you on, it's being recorded. So tell us your name and what your question is.
My name is Martha Oestreich. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm with Global Fund for Women.
Oh, great.
And
Yeah.
I'd say 10 or 12 of our folks were at CSW.
Yeah.
What was that, last week or the
Last
week before?
yeah.
And so I'm curious, it sounds like the treaty is written,
No.
or is not written.
No. So what we have here is the People's Call to Nations. This is a very short one-page sort of whole hand framework. The treaty, we have gone through a global consultation. We're about 4 years in at this point, which began with asking 60 frontline activists from the working group 12 open-ended questions. Then we took that, coded it, split out into 25 special committees on a number of topics, from definition of violence to LGBTQI to women with disabilities to indigenous women. And those groups all came together with recommendations. So Fran chaired the implementation committee. We came up with recommendations there that then went to a group of attorneys from around the world who have come up with a 35-page document of recommendations. But where we are right now is taking that and putting it back out to whoever wants to input on it to get feedback on what have we missed, what's off here, in the same way that I made that mistake with calling everything criminalization the first year. There are going to be things, contexts we don't get, more harm than good on some things. So we want as much feedback from frontline activists and experts. And this time, beyond just frontline activists, we want to be talking with faith leaders. We want to talk with people from, I mean, we are from every region at this point. But the point is, delighted to meet you and would love to get your feedback on the contents of the treaty. Again, Global Fund for Women, we'd love to have Global Fund for Women take a look and give us input. Let us know what you think. We weight all of that very heavily, particularly if the people inputting are survivors or directly serving survivors, with special attention to marginalized groups. But a treaty is only drafted when lead nations write the treaty. And so the process we're in right now is identifying 10 to 20 potential lead nations, and we're vetting them for whether or not the contents that the frontline women's rights activists have written resonates for them, and they're willing to stick to it. And then those are the nations we're going to pair up with and charge forward. That's what the Landmines Treaty did. The Landmines Treaty, had the US was like, yeah, we'll sign the treaty, we're all over it. But they wanted it to have no teeth. So it was Canada that found 7 other nations that were termed core nations that would stick to it, who said, come back this time last year. Charlie, you were there. Come back this time next year, we're going to write this thing. And those 7 nations came together and they wrote the most rigorous version of that treaty they possibly could. So we're identifying that, but we don't expect the actual treaty. It's a 3-year process with governments writing the treaty. And our aim right now is engaging experts. And we consider first and foremost survivors and frontline practitioners experts. But beyond that, certainly, international NGOs that are doing that work, as well as any stakeholders in the space. Because there are little things, like, for instance, in certain Muslim communities, you can't talk about contraception, but you can talk about child spacing. Simple change in words has exactly the same meaning in practical application, but if you just ask the question up front, you end up in a really different place. So that's why the global consultation.
So Lisa, thank you. We only have a couple of minutes left for our formal program. I see several hands up, so I'm going to implore the panelists to stick around. And so please come forward and ask your questions. And we want to use our last few minutes, Tatiana, to talk about the signing. Absolutely, come on up.
So hi everyone, my name is Tatiana Roberts and I'm a first-year MPH candidate at the School of Public Health, and I'm also a member of the Advocacy Initiative. So the Advocacy Initiative is a collective of students, faculty, and practitioners in the field that learn and strategize together on how to be effective change agents and push for policy change. I ask you all to join us in our efforts and become change leaders with us. So tonight, as our panelists have touched on, we've learned about the pervasive human rights issue that is violence against women on both a global and local scale, and we've also identified a proposed solution and evaluated its potential. I want to remind you all of the importance and critical role of advocacy in advancing systems and policy change. We each have a role here today to push this agenda forward and put a stop to this violence. So how do we do this? My ask of you all, and as Lisa already touched on, is to sign the People's Call to Nations. I actually signed this treaty, portion of the treaty back in late January because of my commitment to advancing women's health and women's rights. I also signed this treaty because I actually wanted to put my words and my commitment into action, and I thought this was a really, really important tool to do so. So I'll ask you all to take a few moments. Some of you may find that you have a white packet in front of you, or if not, we also have a app. There's an Every Woman Treaty app that if you have an iPhone, you can find it at the App Store, or if you have an Android on Google Play. Again, all you have to do to search for the app is just put in Every Woman Treaty. And I ask that you sign this document, take a moment to sign this document, and also to list down your reason for signing. So while everyone's just taking a moment to read, I will actually be reading the treaty out loud.
And if we may ask.
Oh, and if we may ask too, that once you've taken a moment to kind of process and sign the treaty, that you stand up in solidarity with us and in community with us. Okay. So the people's call to nations. I stand for a life free from all forms of violence, for every woman and girl, everywhere. I hereby join the call for a global treaty to eradicate violence against women and girls. Article 1. All national parties shall enact or enhance comprehensive national reform. 1. Reform laws to eradicate violence against women and girls. 2. Implement interventions through health, justice, and security professionals who serve survivors such as judges, police, doctors, and nurses. 3. Provide services to survivors of violence. 4. Enact prevention education, campaigns based on rigorous evidence of effectiveness. Article 2. Establish a global implementation fund to finance interventions specified in Article 1 through governments and/or international and local non-governmental organizations. I hereby urge nations to adopt the treaty, mandating that governments and citizens alike undertake the work required to end this pandemic of violence against women and girls.
Tatiana, thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists, and please come up and ask your questions as you have them. And the room looks fabulous with everybody's.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Oh, yeah. And Rosalind, if you track down Rosalind here, she'll be able to take your portrait and your signature, and we will email you your version of this. Or if you download the app, you can take your picture and sign it, and you'll get one of these that gives your reason and your signature that will only go to you. You can share it on social media.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, the School of Public Health.